Guys, if I could have your attention, we're going to go ahead and get started. I just wanted to thank everyone for coming out tonight. We really appreciate it and hope that you enjoy this presentation.
We will.
We do our Return and Learn sessions about once a month during the academic year. We try to vary the topics for each one, so we hope that you'll look for other announcements coming out and see what else is happening. I know we have one in April that's coming from an alum, and he's going to be talking about his journey through the visa and citizenship process. He actually was here as a student from India, so that one's going to be in April. And then we also have Dean Carol Trumpman-Carr doing one in May on kind of what does the curriculum at Moravian look like and how have all the programs changed since everyone was here. So that's, I'm sure, going to be a lengthy one. But definitely look for those and for all of our other events that we do throughout the year. I know most of your faces, or I've gotten to say hi to you when you came in the door, but for anybody that I missed, my name's Amanda and I'm the Director of Alumni and Parent Engagement here at Moravian. So as alums, if you ever need anything, please feel free to reach out to our office. We're always here to help you with whatever you need. And we're located here, so you can come visit me anytime. So I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Cecilia Fox, who chairs our neuroscience program for this timely presentation on neuroscience of love. Dr. Fox?
All right, thank you. Good evening. It's nice to be here. I will say, this is completely outside my realm of specialty, so there was quite a bit of interesting research on my part, which was really interesting for me. I do touch on some of these topics in my neuroscience courses, but I am primarily a neuroscientist that focuses on aging. I study Parkinson's disease, and our students work with rat models of Parkinson's disease and various forms of therapy in these animals. So to talk about the neuroscience of love is interesting and timely, and like I said, we do touch on it throughout the curriculum. So this was kind of fun for me too, just to kind of dive into it a little bit. And feel free to interrupt me at any time if you have a question. I'm certainly happy to address them as we go through. So, all right. I was very impressed that I was actually able to find an image that represented the brain in the shape of a heart.
Oh, you can find just about anything.
Pretty much. So true, right? And so, we think about the basis of love, especially from a scientific perspective. There's a lot of sensationalization going on out in the world, and so what I really wanted to do tonight is introduce more of the science aspect of things, so you could walk away, I guess, with a stronger and more firmer sense of what really happens within the brain when we think about love or affection. Much of what we do understand is very much related to neurochemistry. So your brain produces a variety of chemicals called neurotransmitters, and it's those neurotransmitters that interact with each other to generate, what we perceive, what we sense, what we feel. So there's an interesting question out there. So, is there really a formula for love? What is it and what does it mean? And of course, wouldn't life be simple if there was an interesting formula just for pretty much anything? But you'll find that no, that's not the case. So, when we think about this aspect of attraction, early philosophers thought more about, of course, the heart. It's the heart where you have this feeling. It's the heart that generates all of this kind of emotional responses. And so it's not surprising that for years individuals thought it was the heart that generated made pretty much most of your emotional responses. But of course, we know that that's not the case, and that it's really the brain that generates, your emotional responses. And with that, as the brain is activated, in turn, then it will activate physiologically the body. Okay, and so the brain really is the starting point for this type of sensation. So Helen Fisher, she's over at Rutgers University, and she's done some really interesting work in this field. And she's actually classified romantic love into 3 broad categories. And so the first of which is entitled lust, where we're looking more at sex hormones such as testosterone and estrogen that drive that response. The next phase is attraction. And so when we talk about attraction, now we're involving other chemicals, other neurotransmitters, and dopamine's a big one, norepinephrine is another, and serotonin is another. Each of these have their own distinct structure Each of them have their own receptors that they bind to within the brain, and so they will generate different responses depending on which one is activated at which particular time. And then the last one we think about is attachment. And attachment in and of itself has other hormones or neurotransmitters. We call the first one oxytocin. Oxytocin has a common name known as the cuddling hormone. Some will call it a love hormone. Oxytocin levels definitely rise when a female is going through childbirth. And the whole point there is kind of to prepare the uterus for contractions so you can actually develop a child, but it's also to increase bonding. And so that's why they call it like the cuddling hormone, because they're looking at a maternal-infant bonding that would take place as oxytocin levels just rise naturally during this process of childbirth. Vasopressin is another neuropeptide. It's another neurotransmitter. And vasopressin actually plays more of a role in vasculature, and it plays a role in blood pressure and fluctuations in blood pressure. And so part of that has to do with making sure that these hormones are circulating throughout the bloodstream appropriately. Okay, and so we're seeing some of that as well. So that's just an overview, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on some of these structures. Yeah?
That oxytocin, the first one,
Yeah.
since some women don't bond with their babies, you know, they have, what is it, postpartum depression, I was just wondering,
Yeah.
is that maybe they don't have enough of that?
So there used to be, it's interesting to see that, there used to be studies years ago and looking to examine whether females who actually went through a natural childbirth, because when oxytocin levels rise, when a female, the water breaks and it's time to deliver the baby, it's actually the fetus that has this spike in oxytocin, and that's what's preparing the female's body to actually deliver, okay, when it's time. And so some believe that, oh no, you don't want to have a C-section, because if you have a C-section, you didn't go through labor, then your oxytocin levels wouldn't have risen, and therefore maybe you won't be able to bond with your baby. But that's actually quite false. So there have been interesting studies that have looked at cesarean females and those who went through a vaginal birth to find that no, they had an equal predisposition for bonding with their infants, because regardless, oxytocin levels are going to rise, especially if a female decides to nurse her baby. And so oxytocin levels are still rising. What's interesting though is that with postpartum depression, you're not necessarily negating oxytocin as you are impacting these other neurotransmitters. So for individuals who are experiencing depression, it's not necessarily low oxytocin. It could be actually fluctuations in serotonin, for example, because when individuals don't have enough serotonin, that's when they start to manifest depressive symptoms. When individuals have fluctuations in norepinephrine, sometimes that manifests the anxiety. And so it could be other neurotransmitters that are impacting what's happening with oxytocin. Yeah. I will say oxytocin is interesting. We focus so much on females with oxytocin because of the natural predisposition for childbirth, but there's also some interesting work looking at aged males. And so there's one paper in particular where it talks about like the cuddly grandpa and the grumpy grandpa. And does the cuddly grandpa have more oxytocin? And does the grumpy grandpa have less oxytocin? And so there's just some interesting preliminary research that looks at those things, looking at what levels of oxytocin. So the key players though in generating this hormonal response is going to be the hypothalamus and then the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus is located right here in this portion of the brain. It's a fascinating structure. The hypothalamus has a multitude of functions. It's not just for feeding behavior, thirst behavior, sexual behavior. It gives you a sense of when you're full. It helps in regulating the water balance within your body. The hypothalamus is a very busy structure that I'll show you in a moment, but it communicates with the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland is where the hormones are going to be secreted. And so there's this interesting relationship between the two, because the hypothalamus is kind of the one that's driving the show and then informing the pituitary gland as to what hormones should be secreted and when. And in the hypothalamus, don't worry, I know this is tiny font, but what I wanted to impress upon you was how complex it is. So this structure right here is the hypothalamus, and it has lovely named structures associated with it, but again, some of it's related to feeding behavior. Some of it's related to thermal regulation, like regulating your own body temperature. Again, looking at levels of water balance within a body, because we really are bags of fluid and we need to be well hydrated for our cardiovascular system. Again, this area here too, the preoptic area, that's important when we think about sexual orientation as well. And so there's interesting work there. And so there's a variety of things that the hypothalamus does for a human body, but it's also going to play a role in regulating how some of our hormones are secreted. So getting back to like this kind of image of thinking with lust and attraction and attachment, again, when we think about this aspect of lust, that's where sex hormones come into play. So we think about estrogen in females, testosterone in males. I will say though that females also produce testosterone, not from testes, because females don't necessarily have testes, but from the adrenal gland. There's actually an area within the adrenal gland where females actually get their own testosterone. But the reason that you don't see any of the male characteristics in the female is because there's so much estrogen saturating a female that it masks the effects of testosterone. So they don't have the facial hair and the deepening of the voice, things like that happen at puberty. However, when females go through menopause and the estrogen now goes away, that's when some of that testosterone can actually start to manifest some facial hair. The voice might change a little bit, things like that. But the idea of testosterone, so some of my students will ask me, well, why on earth would people even have this hormone? Well, part of it is because when you think about when males go through puberty, that's when bone mass increases and muscle mass increases. Well, females have bones and females have muscles, and so we need to increase that mass as well. And so that's why females actually do produce some levels of testosterone. But both of them together can, of course, impact how desire takes place. On the next area for attraction, that's where our other hormones kick in. Dopamine in and of itself, I think, is a really fascinating neurotransmitter because depending on where you are in the brain, it does different things. So dopamine in and of itself, if it's in a certain part of the brain known as the substantia nigra, if that gets depleted, then you have an individual who manifests as Parkinson's disease. And so that's just one pathway. In another pathway, if you have too much dopamine, well then you can manifest, if it goes to the frontal lobe, it can manifest aspects of schizophrenia. In this case, there's a reward pathway. And when you have certain activities that you enjoy, so if you enjoy sports, if you enjoy shopping, if you enjoy baking, whatever, the golf, whatever that is, dopamine levels rise within the brain. And part of the reward pathway is because, well, I'm doing these things and I like these things, and I'm going to want to do them again. And so dopamine allows you to do things again because it's part of the reward system. You get a sense of something, you like it, and you want to do it again.
So going to the dentist doesn't do it.
Unless you love your dentist. Might not be.
That's too good.
So, but yeah, so dopamine levels will rise. Oxytocin levels will also rise. I usually joke around with my students because, of course, working in a college situation, and you have so many males and females of the same age, many of them sharing similar interests, that kind of thing. And so there's quite a bit of attraction going on at campus. And so I will use the example of oxytocin levels because when you first meet that person and you think that, wow, they're, this might be a nice guy to go out with, and you start dating early on, well, oxytocin levels will rise in both individuals if it's a mutually agreed upon kind of situation. What they also found, though, is that when oxytocin levels rise, the frontal cortex tends to relax a little bit. And what that means is that, the frontal cortex is really important for things like your intellect, appropriate behavior, inhibition, thank you very much.
Your executive functioning.
I have a child who is now a college freshman at her sinus, and I can't tell you how many times I get off the phone, I'm like, make good choices. Because I know her brain is not fully developed, I know that frontal lobe is not fully developed, I'm like, oh. So, But there we are. But the thing is, I joke around with them, like, those first couple of dates and everything you think is going so well, and you're just, bonding and everything is just so great, and you cannot understand why your roommates think he's awful. And your roommates are wondering, what are you thinking? And so that's kind of the test, right? And so you're with each other for a while, oxytocin levels rise, but then the more you interact with each other and the more you spend time with each other, there's this phenomenon that takes place in the brain where you have what we call a down-regulation. And so as the oxytocin levels rise, the receptors for oxytocin are also rising, thinking, hey, we have all this great hormone, we should bind to you. But then over time, Jeremiah knows, he was my first neurograduate, by the way. Shout out to Jeremiah. So then those oxytocin levels, the receptors start to downregulate because it's like, yeah, we've been binding to this stuff. We don't really need to worry about it as much. So they start to downregulate. Well, then it takes a lot more oxytocin to get that same response. So that's the true test. When those oxytocin receptors drop and the oxytocin's not as high, and now you're coming to your senses, and you're thinking, does this really bother me as much? And maybe it does. And then, you have that time of separation where it's like, it's fun, but now my reasoning has come back. But, of course, as some of you are in coupled situations, as the oxytocin levels declined, you decided to stick it out. And so, for the long haul, for the long-lasting situation. And therefore, okay, so your frontal lobe's saying, hey, it's not so bad. And so you keep going down that path, and of course you have mutual attraction that takes place. Then there's attachment. And so that's part of the oxytocin piece that I was sharing. But it's not just for romantic love. It's also for, when you're with others, like enjoying yourself with others, being social individuals, and wanting to, of course, to engage in fun behavior and doing social things over time. And it's a really important thing, especially as we age, to maintain social connections. And so it's not uncommon to see declines in, of course, some neurotransmitters over time. It's not uncommon to see some of these neurohormones decline over time. But maintaining social engagements has actually been shown to be really helpful for a brain. One thing that we share throughout our programming is really talking about neuroplasticity and talking about the ability of the brain to really rewire itself. And I think that's a fantastic concept because, when I was in graduate school, individuals thought that, well, if you have an aging brain, after 50, neurons are like dying catastrophically. And I'll tell you, as I was approaching 50, going, no. And so it can't be, and I'm happy to say, no, that's so not the case. There are wonderful models of aging out there, healthy brains, staying active, but a big part of it is maintaining cardiovascular health, because that maintains a really healthy brain, because the brain is completely dependent on glucose and oxygen. So that's really important. But what they've also noticed, is that social engagement is really important. So I know for my friends and myself included, when we think of our parents retiring, we wanted to make sure our parents had a retirement plan, not financial stuff, more like the social stuff. Let's make sure you stay engaged. Let's make sure you're going out and trying new things, because that's really going to be beneficial in the long term. So this is part of my Love is Blind perspective. And so what's interesting is that the areas that are highlighted, this is actually what we consider to be more of like functional MRIs and the nature where you can actually see a brain active in real time. And so what we're looking at here is what we call deactivation. So the areas that are actually highlighting are showing you areas that get kind of quiet. And so as you approach more of the red, what you're seeing is that those are parts of the brain that actually start to quiet down. So if you notice, some of this area in here, when we think about this is the frontal lobe, over here and here, and there's some studies that actually compare romantic love to what's happening from a maternal perspective. So the maternal perspective, if you're wondering, well, why is that there? Again, we're seeing some deactivation here, and it's really part of the selflessness of mothers, is how it's been coined, to think about mothers who are actually going to engage with their babies, and regardless of the fact that the baby has thrown food on you and the baby's crying and screaming all night, that you will still love this baby. And so the idea is that you've kind of suppressed some of that logical thinking. Like, so for example, if your significant other was to cry and scream at you all night, you may not be as forgiving. But with a baby, you're like, okay, we'll let that go. With romantic love, this idea that as oxytocin levels are rising, what you're finding is that, and of course also dopamine is a culprit here, because dopamine is giving you part of that reward pathway, but this is a good feeling, I want to keep this good feeling. And so the idea that you can deactivate part of the frontal cortex, because again, you're just being very forgiving of whatever those little quirky things that will annoy you later in life are. And so yeah, so these are just some interesting studies. So that's where the love is blind piece usually pops in. But as I always tell my majors, too much of a good thing is never a good thing. So some people think, oh, a lot of dopamine, that's got to be good, or all this oxytocin has to be good. Not necessarily, because if we're looking at healthy relationships, we want to have a nice balance between our dopamine and our oxytocin. You want that bonding to happen, and you'd like that reward to continue. However, if we kind of get on that runaway train and we get too much, especially with dopamine in particular, there can be some addictive behaviors that develop. So when we start talking about neurotransmitters in some of our courses, I go through the normalcy of it, what it's there for, why do you have it, and then we start talking about what happens when you go in one way or the other, too much or too little. And so in the treatment of Parkinson's disease, for example, they're looking to increase levels of dopamine in these individuals who are, having depleted levels. For a person to actually manifest the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, they've already lost about 85% of the neurons within that little part of the brain called the substantia nigra. Up until that point, they look completely normal. And so what can happen, though, is that if you want to introduce some medications to amp up dopamine, that's great, and that's part of what some of the treatments like L-Dopa will do. It helps to increase levels of dopamine. But you're taking this orally, it's entering into the brain just kind of broadly through vasculature, and now other parts of the brain that have some dopamine can also respond. Okay, and that's where the problems can develop. So for that reward pathway, you can lead into some addictive behaviors. And so usually neurologists have to really be very careful in how they administer these medications for Parkinson's patients, because some of them become gambling addicts, sex addicts, shopping addicts, they were binge eating, all of those different types of things. And so they have to be super careful. And of course, if you have too much dopamine as well, some individuals might start hallucinating, along like the schizophrenic tendency type of thing. You have to be really careful with all of that. So again, too much of a good thing is not a good thing.
I just read Awakenings by Oliver Sacks.
Oh, it's fantastic. Yeah.
Very fantastic.
Yes, one of my favorite books. Actually, Oliver Sacks, I believe if you go into my office, I have every book he's ever written. It's all on there. He's just such a wonderful, in case you're not familiar, he's a neurologist. He recently passed away, unfortunately.
2015.
Yeah, and he was a neurologist. However, he wrote these wonderful books that anyone can read. I mean, right? It's just for
They're
any...
stimulating, they're heartwarming, they make you look things up. It's wonderful.
Absolutely. And if any of you are interested in like music, he has a wonderful book called CECILIA, and it talks about some of the interesting pieces of music and what it has done to the brain, and how individuals can have hallucinations of music and how that manifests itself. And the individuals have strokes, and all of a sudden, as they're going through therapy and whatnot, they become savants in music. And so my daughter's a violinist, and so a lot of that appeals to me. So I've always been reading some of those things. But he was a wonderful author. And so yeah, so absolutely. And again, giving too much of L-Dopa can lead you down this path that you weren't expecting, that can lead to a variety of behaviors. And so, here, of course, also if you're pushing the envelope of irrational behavior, jealousy, things of that nature, and so it can take you down rather a negative turn when there are just too much of dopamine and oxytocin. So But with that said, one thing that we also focus in our programming has to do with self-compassion. I think in today's world where you have so many individuals in this particular age group where they are bombarded with social media all the time, we talk about developing resilience, we talk about developing grit, don't we? I'm sure you've heard of these terms when we think about our youth today coming out of high school and going into colleges. And so part of what I also talk with our students is the neuroscience behind compassion and how to have self-compassion as they're going through programming and getting stressed and whatnot. And so what I wanted to do is not just talk about romantic love in this way, but also about compassionate love. Because I think developing these connections with others is something that benefits everyone. There's some fascinating research on this as well. So this area of the brain is called the supramarginal gyrus. It's called that because here you have the frontal lobe, parietal, occipital, and temporal. And here is this sulcus called the lateral sulcus right here. And this gyrus just kind of swings around a little bit and merges with the angular gyrus. But it's the supramarginal gyrus that has actually been noted to play a role in compassion, which is really kind of interesting. What's fascinating about this particular piece, and again, this is through active scans that they can see what the brain is doing in real time, that if, for example, an individual displays maybe a lack of empathy, it's the supramarginal gyrus that sort of auto-corrects for this. It also says kind of, wait a minute, no, we really need to think about this a little bit. You know, we can't be so selfish. And so there's an auto-correct piece that can develop there. And so I put a little bullet here that they've noticed that if an individual needs to make a drastic decision, a really quick decision, it can actually impair their ability to empathize or to express compassion. And so some of the classic examples are, you know, if you hear someone scream fire, you know, what is your natural inclination? Is it self-preservation, or is it just right to bolt through the door? Hold your wife's hand as you're doing it, please. Or do you stay and do you help others? But mostly individuals tend to have an inclination to protect themselves. What's interesting though is that how do we connect with each other, and how is it that we can relate to each other, especially during times of suffering? And we do have a system within the brain called the mirror neuron system. And this neuron system was actually first described in macaque non-human primates. And I was able to witness this firsthand when I was in graduate school, because my graduate training, I worked with rhesus non-human primates. And they were our models for Parkinson's disease back then. And so the idea here is when an individual is, in early some research, what they did was more action-based. So if someone went to grab a piece of fruit that the non-human primate observing, the same parts of the brain were activated even though they weren't grabbing for the piece of fruit. So they were able to relate that, oh, that was movement of the upper limb. They went and grabbed the piece of fruit and retracted it to eat it. So yes, you have this activity going on in the primate that's actually engaged in the behavior, but you're also seeing in the other primate the same activation of the brain even though they're not doing anything. And so the idea that you're able to kind of mimic and understand what's happening in between primates. The way in which we would notice it as well in our rhesus primates is when animals would return from surgery, each female was housed in their own cages. And we had video cameras on every cage so we could monitor the primates. We didn't really stay in the room because they didn't want us to be in the room clearly. So what we would do is we would just monitor them from a separate laboratory. And when the non-human primate came in, what was interesting is that as they were waking up from surgery, immediately you could see the primates on either side put their hands through the cages to hold their hands as they were waiting for them to come out of surgery. And they would notice, and again, of course, in the world of research, we were creating hemi-Parkinsonian animals. These animals don't look like your typical Parkinson patient. They don't have the resting tremor that a human has. They have an action tremor, which is interesting. So it's just that one wiring that's a little bit different, although all of the other symptoms are the same. So that's the only thing that was classically different. And so once the animals were healed, They could still feed themselves, they could still groom themselves, but we would notice that when the animals were being tested and they went to reach for their piece of fruit and they saw the tremor, the primates on either side would stop and just observe. Like they wouldn't even go for the fruit. They would wait and just observe and make sure. It was almost like, if us interpreting this, was that they were waiting for their peer to get the fruit before they jumped in and grabbed it. Gave them the chance to do it, and then they would come in. And so it's interesting to see how we can almost view aspects of some kind of form of compassion here in making sure that others were cared for themselves. What's interesting though is that when we look at this from a functional MRI perspective, now this is a different way of reading this particular field where we're seeing increased activation in this one. So this is increased activation when you have the colors. You can play around with colors to get whatever you want really in some of the readings. But for this, we're looking at an increase in activation. So if a person is sensing pain, these areas of the brain will typically light up. Part of the sensory cortex is lighting up in here as well. But the person who's witnessing the pain, so you can have someone in a scanner and they're actually just showing you images that can be equate to pain, right? Something that someone's suffering. And yet the similar parts of the brain are being activated even though they themselves are not actually feeling the pain. And so clearly there's an issue here when we think about what it means to kind of relate to someone else and feel compassion or empathy for someone else. I will say though, in my work with what I do with my students, I usually open it up and I ask students to select topics toward the end of a semester. Like, so what do you want to talk about? You know? And this one year, I don't know, it was a big CSI Criminal Minds year. They wanted a psychopathic brain. I'm like, okay then, off we go. So we spent a couple of weeks studying the psychopathic brain. One thing that's really fascinating is that individuals who are, of course, been incarcerated within the prison system and are described and characterized as psychopaths, they do not have this kind of activation at all. Like there's nothing going on there. So when they witness individuals experiencing pain, that part of the brain does not light up at all. What's also fascinating though is that if they are sensing pain themselves, so you can have someone in there and just do a simple pinprick on the hand kind of thing and see what part of the brain will activate. When the pinprick is done to them, they get an exaggerated response. It's like so much more than anything that we would see in just your typical individual who does not have those tendencies. When they track these individuals and look at their childhood, what is a common denominator among these individuals, interestingly enough, is that they did not have free play. Like free play, when you think about what it means just to play. And it could be for a variety of reasons, whether their parents were not attentive and they were caring for other children, that kind of thing. But when you think about free play and going out and playing in the backyard and going with friends and problem solving and all the good traits really that children learn by engaging in social play, that is free play without a parent organizing any of it, right? There's conflict resolution, there's understanding. Yeah.
Does that mean we are in big trouble with all the kids that are overscheduled and they're all going to be psychopaths?
No. Thankfully not.
Yeah, they're not out running around playing anymore.
But there's a lot of creativity and free play that goes on even in organized sporting and things like that. Yes, as a mother of 2 children, yes, absolutely.
But there is a difference. I've been a school psychologist.
Very much so, right? Yes.
There is a big difference from 30 years ago.
Oh yes, very much so. Oh yes, my parents, we joke around with my parents all the time, saying they never knew where we were. My brother and I, growing up in Queens, New York, we were gone in the summertime. And for as long as we were together, Mom and Dad didn't mind. The street lights came on. That's how you know when to go home.
Exactly.
That's it, right?
Exactly.
And you spent your days doing all sorts of different things.
Well, and at that time, it was not unusual for an 8-year-old. I had a friend that lived in Philly. He took the bus to the stadium and saw the Phillies alone. Now his parents would be jailed for that.
It's true. It's a very different world, unfortunately. Yeah, and so it's funny how you have to orchestrate your own free play. You have to orchestrate it now, and there needs to be some kind of sense of safety about it, right?
Well, you have to be more reasonable, but there is a big difference in our society.
Oh,
We've become much more fearful And there's no line between adulthood and childhood anymore. Because our kids are exposed to everything through the media. Before that, you had to be able to read, before you could know that. So 7-year-olds didn't know about all the tragedies and all that unless their parents told them.
Right, yeah, very true.
I mean, when the towers came down, they watched it on TV and they thought every tower in the world was coming down. Seriously.
Yeah.
Because they saw it 10,000 times and they thought each one was a separate, little kids don't get that. They thought it was all happening over and over and over and over again.
Yeah, yes.
Just out of curiosity, because this is something that I've always, I like feel heartbroken sometimes for kids that didn't grow up the way we did, where you'd out on your bike at 8 o'clock in the morning, and that was it all summer long. And I feel bad for them. But are there studies that are done about what we were just talking about?
Longitudinal studies. That's the harder piece.
Yeah,
because no one's
true.
really known to look at it. I mean, now we're looking at things, but we're starting off. The same thing when you think about, you're talking about access to technology and media.
Right.
So now there are longitudinal studies looking at, okay, what happens when you pop a 2-year-old in front of an iPad? And
What
that's-
happens
and
when you
that's
pop
their-
an 8-month-old in front of an iPad
Yeah.
and they never see a book or a crayon until they get to kindergarten?
Yeah, no, it's
Think
true.
about that.
It's true. The studies that I'm aware of start with the 2 is this point. Yes.
There's one other big thing that a lot of people don't take into consideration. I grew up in the 50s, well, 60s. The world had less than a quarter of the population it has now.
Yeah.
The United States population is well under 200 million people. Well under, it didn't hit that to 1970. And there were a lot less criminality and things like that going on because you didn't have the people. The world now has 7.5 billion people, which is a lot more than 1.5 billion people.
Sure.
So things have changed considerably because of the population.
Right.
And it's never happened before in history. So.
Well, and societal change has changed too.
Absolutely, yes. And access to this information.
I was one of the few that had a working mother when I was growing up. Mothers stayed home. How many mothers stay home now? You can't afford to.
Right.
But societal norms have changed.
Very much so.
And the living in fear, you're right. Everything's ramped up more in the
Right.
fear, and I wonder how
And I
there's
don't-
studies done on that.
And I don't know that organized activities are necessarily that bad. I think it's the overbooking of kids.
Yeah.
Because kids learn a lot from coaches. The kids learn a lot from teamwork. They do.
Oh, sure.
But they do need that free play
They do.
time.
They need the quiet. They need to be alone. And understand it's okay to be alone with your thoughts. It's okay to be, engaged in something else that doesn't keep them going. Absolutely. Yeah.
Coming back to the, when the students were investigating, that you were investigating, and there was this lack of empathy. Was there a tie-in ultimately with that to the levels of oxytocin?
Oh, we didn't see anything about oxytocin in that regard. Yeah. There were separate studies, not linked to this. There were separate studies looking at oxytocin levels in general, and they seemed to be lower. There was a lower baseline. But to like one study that looked at low levels of oxytocin correlated to this, we didn't see that. No. That'd be a good study to follow up on, of course. Yes. Yes.
A question about young men and sometimes young women who are exposed to high levels of violence. They're in combat, and what actually happens to what's going on physiologically or chemically in their brains, and why does it sometimes develop or translate to PTSD?
So there's a stress hormone that we naturally have, and cortisol. And cortisol is an important hormone. It gets a bad rep every now and then, but it's a good hormone for example, if like my students, they don't have breakfast in the morning, right? So now the last time they ate was 8 o'clock the night before, 6 o'clock the night before, and basically what cortisol's doing is just releasing some glucose from the liver so they can stay with me and they're not passing out. There are good things about cortisol, changing in blood flow, things like that. The problem happens when it's chronically stressed. When individuals are chronically stressed, you have really high levels of cortisol over time. Cortisol can impact parts of the brain like the hippocampus, which is essential for learning and memory, and also it plays a role like spatial navigation and things of that nature. What happens though too is that with really high levels of cortisol, you can also see like cells are going to actually start to atrophy. They're going to start to die. And So that level where you're having all of this excess hormone, it can start impacting how well the brain receives blood supply, how well that they can metabolize glucose, things like that. I mean, the brain itself is taking a global hit. That's from a metabolic perspective, not like a trauma perspective, like concussive perspective. And that's just one aspect of it. But again, it's a lot of it's so much neurochemistry. And when individuals are recalling memories, sometimes they'll go into this loop of rumination, and they're constantly remembering these things. One of my colleagues, she specializes in memory, and one thing that is well known is that when people recall a memory, you alter that memory every time you recall it, just based on your circumstances, based on where you are in a certain period of time, things like that. And so you're also impacting it that way. So the neurochemistry piece is being thrown off, and cortisol is a big culprit in that.
Well, you said earlier about the brain having the ability to, you referred to it as the plasticity.
Yes, rewire itself.
So-
and then, yeah. So
Neuroplasticity.
cognitive behavior therapies, things of that nature. So when you have individuals who are struggling with mental health issues, all is not lost. I mean, really, and it doesn't matter the age. What we've noticed is that plasticity can happen throughout a person's lifetime, and that's the great news. So it's not just about medication. There has to be some form of cognitive behavior therapy that will help an individuals reframe their thinking, reframe what it is that is the cause, right, of that kind of thought process and whatnot, and it's really helping them through that. So it's an important piece, really. And then from a physiological perspective, sometimes, of course, they'll introduce aspects of meditation and exercise and that kind of thing, because that increases endorphin levels, that increases oxytocin levels, and dopamine. And so the idea is, let's bring back some of these really good neurotransmitters that will help you to feel better. It's a really complex beast, unfortunately. Yeah. So, very much so. Other questions?
Well, one thing I just want to mention, in my previous profession, I came across quite a few murderers, and most of them had no empathy at all. They killed people. I know one 19-year-old that killed 3 people. Didn't bother him a bit. He laughed about it. No sympathy, and I've dealt with some other ones, and no empathy
In some
at all.
cases, it's conditioned out of them, depending on what their upbringing was like, what they were exposed to. And for them, they may have come from very violent situations, so it wasn't something that would trigger
And most ones I knew instigated the out of nowhere. I mean, just the 19-year-old just decided to kill his neighbors. I mean, broke into the house and raped the woman and killed her 2 children. With a hammer. It was just...
Wow, incredibly violent.
Yeah.
Interesting. I know. And there's certain programs, of course, available, but you have to catch these things earlier in life before you get to that point, right? So, one thing I am going to share as we kind of continue on is that developing this, and that's the thing. I mean, in certain systems, what we're seeing is now, in certain prison systems, how can you develop empathy? How can you strengthen aspects of compassion? Not just in the prison system, of course, but just in the general population. And so I usually ask my students if they can tell me the difference between empathy and compassion. So I'll throw it out there. Can you tell me a key difference between empathy and compassion? What comes to mind?
Empathy, you can put yourself into the other person's situation and feel what they're feeling.
Okay. Yeah, excellent. And so what do we think about compassion? How is that different?
Maybe has more action attached to it.
And
Will you do something to help or no?
okay. Yes. Okay, that feeling to help, reach out, that kind of thing. Which one do you think has a higher sense of self-preservation, though? Do you want a physician who's empathetic, or do you want a physician who's compassionate?
I think compassionate, because I think if they have too much empathy, they can't be unbiased.
Okay, yeah. And so many of my students are pre-med students, and we talk about this because there's nothing wrong with being empathetic, there's nothing wrong with it, but it will take a toll on you if you bring and carry that with you all the time. And so, when we think about the various aspects of empathy and compassion, empathy is you're right, you're putting yourself in that person's shoes, right? You're feeling what they're feeling. But compassion is basically when someone's in pain, the compassion reaction does not replicate the painful state, but it produces the feeling of concern, of warmth, of wanting to help, right? That sense of connection there. So the thing that we want to really consider for individuals who are caregivers, physicians and healthcare professionals is that, empathy can be painful and it can be felt by the brain. You've seen that, the brain will register that feeling. But compassion leaves a less destructive toll on an individual, especially if they're going into this situation. So I have a former student of mine who's now a pediatric oncologist. And so you can imagine, day in and day out, she is with these patients. And so understanding what it means to make that distinction between empathy and compassion is really helping her, give her best and to be able to take care of her patients.
And sometimes compassion does not mean not making the hard decision.
Oh, absolutely.
And sometimes I think with people with empathy get caught up in they have to do everything to make everything better, and sometimes you can't.
Yeah, sometimes you can't do that. You're right. Absolutely.
And sometimes you have to say enough's enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to this aspect of self-compassion, in today's world of Instagram and Snapchat and how many likes do you have and all of this, it's exhausting to watch. And so understanding that, okay, if a mistake is made, it's okay. You gotta be good to yourselves, and you have to take that time away from your electronics just to kind of recenter sometimes.
I have a question. For medical providers, if you're going to a doctor for whatever reason, and you have a physician that says others have it worse than you, what is he lacking? Why is he saying this?
I hesitate to say he's lacking anything, as he is. I think he's just trying to take a very practical approach. My father is going through a very difficult time health-wise, and I've seen the gamut of physicians. And we have interacted with physicians such as that you've described. And so, as jarring as it is for my mother to hear, I also come in from a perspective, it's probably because of years of treatment and years of caring for patients, and in some ways I believe that physician feels that they're saying the right thing, though it may not come across. But
and they have their continuum of all the people that they see with the same condition.
They have a different perspective.
Yes.
And so as I share with my mom, I think it's just perspective that we're coming at from two very different places.
And it could be the patient's perspective too, that they have to make everything all better and there can't be any negatives associated to it, and that's not always possible.
No, not at all. That's very true. So one area that I share with my students, just because I think that if we talk about individuals who have lived some pretty tough lives, and what does it mean to think about a compassionate society. About 20 years ago, that's when I first heard the Dalai Lama speak at a Society for Neuroscience conference. And it was an interesting event because you wouldn't think that the Dalai Lama would be going to the Society for Neuroscience event. And it was in Washington, D.C., and I was with my students, and I remember we left here and we were driving, because I'm like, we cannot miss this. I'm like, we have to make sure we get to this. And it was an incredibly populated conference, and I will share that Society for Neuroscience is the largest organization in my discipline, and so it attracts about 40,000 individuals wherever it goes. And so that year we're at Washington, D.C., last year we're at San Diego and Chicago, and so you have a bunch of geeky neuroscientists literally descending on a city when that conference takes place every fall. And when the Dalai Lama was there, he was there at the invitation of Dr. Richard Davison, who is at the University of Wisconsin, and he's done some phenomenal work looking at just overall wellness and mindfulness meditation and the impact it has on neuroplasticity. But the Dalai Lama actually challenged not just Davidson but others about, you've been using these tools of modern neuroscience to study depression and anxiety and fear, so why can't you use those same tools to study kindness and compassion? And how is it that we can develop a more compassionate society? And so he has spent years working with the Dalai Lama as well as other Buddhist monks who are actually going through their training. And so they've done scans at the start of the meditative practice, and then years later toward the end of their meditative practice within a certain time period. And what they found is that these areas of the brain that I showed you that register for empathy and the supramarginal gyrus and whatnot have completely increased in their activity by several fold. And the idea that you could actually rewire a brain to be more compassionate has been really amazing. And not only that, he actually has done some studies by partnering with physiology departments and looking at cardiovascular function and noticing that these individuals who have really mastered this aspect of mindfulness meditation and really developing in compassion and empathy, they tend to have like really active and strong cardiovascular systems, to the point when they're actually in the process of this compassionate meditation that they do, their heart rate is increasing and their blood flow is increasing, and so it's benefiting the body in a really interesting way. So it talks about this mind-body connection that exists. And so Davison's been one of the pioneers in this area, and so he has, if you're interested, his website's fantastic. You just have to go to the University of Wisconsin website, type in Richard Davison, and it'll come up. And it's just really fascinating, some of the work that he's done in looking at this. And so I just ended with this. I just thought this was a nice way of tying things together. So we've got this deep human connection, and what does it mean? And it's the purpose and the result of a meaningful life. And it'll inspire the most amazing acts of love, generosity, and humanity. So in addition to teaching our neuro majors about the brain and behavior, part of the goal of the neuroscience program, as well as in the Department of Biological Sciences, is to really educate our students as to what it means to actually develop really fulfilling lives, and to develop this aspect of compassion and self-compassion, and therefore hopefully, going out into the world and doing great things. So, like Jeremiah. So yeah. So thank you. Happy to answer them, but thank you for being so engaging.
Great presentation.
Oh, thank
Fantastic.
you. Thank you.
Richard Davison.
Guys, please feel free to help yourself to more snacks. I think Dr. Fox brought some.
Oh,
fun.
yes, I brought you Valentines. They were actually brain pops. Help yourself.
Ladies first.
So if you have any questions, feel free to ask Dr. Fox before she heads out for me.
Fantastic.
All right.
Great
Thank you all.
presentation. Man, you're fantastic.
I love it. Yeah. Sure.